Welcome, boys and girls, to Trivia Time! This episode is pretty monumental in its own right, quality-wise, but I ran into so many random factoids about this episode that I thought might interest you. Originally, this episode was due to be aired before the library episodes, where it would have been the 50th episode of the revival. This is referenced by the title of the shuttle, train, bus, car, ship thing, Crusader 50. In the grand scheme of the show, this is the 200th story of the show. To be clear, I don't mean the 200th episode, as the classic era has nearly 700 episodes alone. Speaking of the classic era, Patrick Troughton's son, David, stars as Professor Hobbs in this episode. The actor also appears a few times in the classic era of Who, even when his father was the Doctor. The episode itself is directed by a lady named Alice Troughton, who actually shares no relation to Patrick and David. You'll notice this episode is one of those rare ones which doesn't star the TARDIS, but does star Leslie Sharp, previous co-star of The Second Coming, starring Chris Eccleston and written by Russell T Davies. In 2016, this episode was adapted into a stage play and performed at Adelaide Fringe Festival in Australia. Apparently it wasn't very good though, and quite frankly I'm cringing at the photographs of it all. The character Jethro was also the star of the BBC Saturday 7pm slot replacement show Merlin. I won't be reviewing that, but I will be giving my thoughts on the two Doctor Who spin-off shows, Sarah Jane Adventures and Torchwood, exclusively on my Patreon page in July. Make a pledge today and you'll get access to other reviews like Rise of the Cybermen, Age of Steel and The Lazarus Experiment. Now, without further ado, let's get on with the review. The intro of this episode is just magnificent. The long overdue holiday is taking place this episode, and the Doctor's descriptions of sapphire waterfalls match beautifully with the scenic establishing shots strewn throughout. It's quite funny as well watching this episode knowing how iconic these holiday episodes always wind up being. On board, I loved the joke aimed at airline companies that throws so much waste at you on flights. It gives a nice introduction to the air hostess character, who talks like she's reading from the dullest script on the planet. All the other characters we're introduced to here are just perfect. Jethro sitting away from his parents out of spite was wonderful, and this master-apprentice situation going on in the row behind the Doctor was good too. Great, simple characters that we can relate to very quickly. I also loved that Davies sees the future of transportation, bombarding the passenger with as much entertainment as possible. The Doctor does the right thing by suggesting that they should all talk to each other, and this was the perfect way to get our characters to be fleshed out. This montage that followed was fantastic. Watching the parents give this big speech that Jethro's heard 1,000 times before was funny. Not just because most of them are laughing out of politeness, but seeing Jethro mimicking his father was a nice touch to foreshadow the same activity that will ruin them all later. Even the typewriter transitions of clicks were interesting, seeing as this is a fictional measurement of distance, not time. The Professor's presentation came at the right time too, coming off more like a persuasive tin hat conspiracy theorist than a man of learning. This was halted by the first instances of dread being forced upon the viewer. There's no need to panic though, it's just like turbulence, right? No! It's time for the scariest bit of the whole episode. What are you talking about, Harry? Sky's not even been possessed yet. Well, if you've been watching my videos long enough, you'll know it's the unseen, unknown Lovecraftian horror that I really admire. When we see this beautiful exterior, feeling safe in the knowledge that nothing could live out there, this trainee pilot starts seeing something. He draws our characters, and by extension the audience, to search with their eyes like Spot the Difference or some other childlike game. Of course, the image itself doesn't have something dark or anything noticeable for us to see, yet the flickers on the surface, this flashing red light, all are designed to deceive us into believing there's something moving out there. Accompanied by this character's fright, this is the closest we get to seeing this episode's monster. Even still, he could have been imagining it, but it's this restraint that sends the imagination into overdrive. Ironically enough, the Doctor's instructions to keep a secret doesn't stop the speculation from running rampant. Like Chinese whispers, the suggestion that they're running out of air becomes a possibility. This too is conjured up by the imagination of the worst case scenario. It's pretty infectious, which again plays on this idea of possession. Are we ourselves constantly possessed by fear? This episode proves to be highly original too, in that this is a circumstance where the Doctor doesn't have the authority or control over others that he would ordinarily. Lying is certainly not something he would be accustomed to doing either, which is why he's so bad at it. Worst of all is that he's not even got Donna to back him up here. By limiting our protagonists in this way, it makes for one of the most intense episodes in the show's history. Then the monster starts knocking on the walls, and the reactions from everybody were stellar. Even before it gets in, it started this learning process by repeating knocks. It begins introducing this idea of fearing the unknown. They are in a place that allegedly no life has been to before, with a creature nobody can see because of the volatile exterior, which is obviously able to survive in such conditions. This much is known. However, it's the belief in what it is that stirs up the passengers the most. Skye, for instance, believes the creature is coming for her without truly knowing this. Yet this is the truth of the situation once the cockpit has been cleaved off into oblivion. Unfortunately, I find the excessive panic of this moment a bit melodramatic for me, and it was also a bit weird that they would store torches in the back pockets of the seats. After that explosion of noise, things get pretty weird again once silence has fallen. The way the torches produce this amazing shadowy effect indicates that something dark has indeed made its way onto the train. And that flipping piano... ugh, it's horrible. Skye then started copying everyone like an annoying child. The childishness of the repeating, like in the library episodes, is what makes it so creepy. In one way, it's mocking, but we also like the sound of our own voices so much that we don't normally think about the words and intonations that naturally pour out of our mouths. Producer for the show, Phil Collinson, compared it to a dripping tap, which is the perfect analogy in my opinion. Tennant and Sharp's performances shoot off into the stratosphere in this segment. How cruel it was that Davies made the pair learn the square root of pi to an absurd decimal place, and even having them repeat it out of sync created such an amazing effect as all the adults reacted with sheer disbelief. The tension booms up again as a wall of noisy voices blast the audience into submission. I can imagine the dubbers and audio editors must have had a field day making this episode. The confidential for this episode is truly fascinating to watch as well, as you see these numerous takes of this same moment, every line of dialogue being recorded to the point that everyone else would have to mime for moments like this. Being on set was apparently no joyride for these actors either. Lindsay Coulson said during her experience starring in this episode that she would go whole days without seeing the sun because they'd wake up, go to the studio, and go home when it was dark after shooting in these claustrophobic conditions. This schedule was probably deliberate to heighten emotions like paranoia, panic, and irritation in their performances. With the characters' voices now synchronized with hers, this is another testament to the superb performances and high level of filmmaking at work here. Do you know how difficult it is to copy somebody word for word, beat for beat? Sure, they all have a script, but the intonations and emotions have to be the same as well. Seeing Tennant and Sharp in shot together, copying each other so perfectly was astounding and terrifying. It's perfect too because you can naturally predict the next stage of this thing's speech copying at this point. However, what it leads to is far more nuanced than that, because it has not only copied speech and expression, but now has understood how suspicious of authority we humans can be. How that primal pack hunter mentality is still deeply ingrained within us is used to a horrifying effect. We certainly can band together to achieve better things, but we also use it to oust authority. The Doctor being so comfy being the leader in 99% of scenarios the show throws at us makes him trip up and seem pompous. He then comes full circle by saying that his intelligence is reason enough to trust him, but this doesn't persuade anybody. I love the way Skye was lit when she's just crouching on the floor. Again, it plays on the childishness of it all, because children see putting a torch beneath your chin as indicative of horror. But when an adult does it, we start fearing the other humans because they can be just as monstrous as this unseen being.
We should throw her out.
This shot of the air hostess, I don't know what it is about seeing her framed as though reflected with sky staring ominously in center frame, but I love this shot. It's almost like the thing, the dark, the shadow, is learning the ultimate lesson about humanity here, that we too can be monsters. Even these loud blasts from the score I just played to you are so unsettling. Worst of all though, the hostess was right all along. Throwing Sky out would have been the best idea. However, the characters at this point don't have the luxury of hindsight like we do, with the Doctor enacting this role of the curious scientist, normally depicted in fiction as the bad guy.
Let me take this back to my lab to be analyzed. The whole world could benefit from this.
Blah blah blah. Like a pack of wolves, the humans turn on the Doctor. I love that murder is on their lips, and even voting on the decision gets thrown into the air as though morals are just thrown to the wind when all we have is survival. Just as in this episode, you want to have faith in the Doctor, but we know that ultimately his pacifistic attitude can't actually help the situation and nearly gets him killed. Fear has warped our characters, but ultimately it was what we have been surviving on since time in memoriam. Best of all is that we as viewers can sympathize with them all, because the situation presented to us in this episode is just that scary. The third phase arrives freakishly unannounced, feeding off of fear and seeing the Doctor as the bigger threat. At this point also, I thought it worth mentioning that the characters are still acting entirely on conjecture. In terms of learning, copying is something that we do all the time, consciously and unconsciously. When Jethro suggests that the thing has transferred to the Doctor, this is obviously untrue in hindsight, but the audience's minds are racing, trying to make logical sense of it all, but we still don't truly know anything, and that is horrifying. The performances from our leading pair are once again pouring gold into our laps. Sky insidiously plays the victim whilst the Doctor struggles to do anything. The strain on his face and in his voice is felt as things escalate for one last time. He is visibly shaking with fear by the time Mr. Kane comes along to throw him out. The lighting is immaculate too, as the light is now beneath the Doctor and above Sky, like a celebrity executioner carrying out the sentence. The music is so unbelievably dread-inducing too, as we know exactly what's going to happen next. Only divine intervention could possibly save him, or maybe just a little dash of heroism. The hostess then becomes the unsung hero of the tale, as what follows is just jaw-dropping. Mrs. Kane barking orders, a puppet of the darkness without even being possessed. How throwing a person takes more than just the push of a button, but the slow process of three fully grown men trying to drag somebody across the floor was absolutely painful to watch. Even an attack on the Professor's masculinity and Jethro just wanting it to be over, the power over the passenger Sky has is truly absolute. It's like a miniature revolution has taken place in a matter of minutes, and then the regime gets toppled in seconds by the unnamed hostess. Seeing all the passengers collapse under the weight of their own shame, and the music heard here really plays on this idea too. Right up until the very end of the scene though, Mrs. Kane still can't admit she was at fault. It's enraging, this line, but is symbolic of the bigger picture. Human nature will never change, and heroes will always be forgotten. Not even the Doctor can muster a response. That ending scene with Donna was downright perfect too. Every single companion the 10th Doctor has had a "don't" comment.
No, don't do that. No, really don't.
For poor imitation.
No, don't do that. Don't. No, don't do that. Don't.
But this time it's so starkly different.
No, don't do that. Don't. Don't.
It's the perfect way to show how traumatized the Doctor has become after that journey. Worst of all, and I don't know if anybody else felt like this, but this was the first instance that I started to contemplate the idea of a sad ending to the series. Obviously, we are coming to the end of Series 4 anyway, but without knowing that Davies, Donna, and David would all be leaving the show in 8 episodes' time, this ending is better than any prophecy of doom and gloom could ever provide. So, Did it suck? Well, of course not.
Well, what do you expect? Pumpkin juice?
No, seriously, I only find the first screaming and shouting, "It's coming for memes," a bit cringe, but aside from that, this is another near-perfect story that makes me question the nature of existence. The music, the performers, the writing is just immaculate. I give Midnight a 9.5 out of 10. Thanks for watching. Look at all these gorgeous names. We are so bloody close to our next Patreon goal. What do you think of this episode? Comment below your thoughts or join us for a Benny on my Discord server, where we'll continue this discussion.